When a homeless man approached Shaq O'Neal asking for just $1, no one expected what would happen next. What started as a simple act of kindness would spark a national movement and change lives forever. It was a cold winter morning in Cleveland, Ohio. The streets were alive with the usual city chaos, cars honking, people rushing to work, and the hum of conversations blending into the air. On the corner of Broad Street and 17th Avenue, a man named Leonard sat against the wall of an old convenience store. His clothes were layers of tattered fabric, barely protecting him from the biting wind. His face was worn and tired, with a thick beard that hadn't seen a razor in months. Beside him lay a cardboard sign that read, "Anything helps." God bless Leonard was 42 years old, but life had aged him far beyond his years. It had been almost a year since he lost everything: his job, his home, and even his sense of purpose. He used to work at a factory, but when it shut down, Leonard's life started spiraling out of control. Without a steady paycheck, he couldn't keep up with his bills. Soon after, his health began to fail, and before he knew it, he was on the streets. Every day was a battle for survival. Leonard relied on the kindness of strangers to get through each day. Sometimes people would toss a few coins his way without even looking at him. Other times, they would avoid him entirely, walking past as if he were invisible. He had grown used to the feeling of being ignored. That morning, Leonard shivered as he watched people pass him by. High heels clicked on the pavement, polished shoes shone in the sunlight, and sneakers darted by in a hurry. Leonard sat quietly, his eyes scanning the crowd for a kind face. He wasn't expecting much, just enough for a cup of coffee to warm his hands. As he adjusted his beanie and pulled his jacket tighter, something unusual caught his eye. A pair of sneakers, big and pristine white, stopped just a few feet away. These weren't just regular sneakers, they were massive, almost custom-made. Leonard's curiosity piqued as he looked up to see who was wearing them. Standing there was a towering man, well over 7 feet tall, wearing a sleek tracksuit and a warm smile. It took Leonard a moment, but then he recognized the face. This wasn't just any man. It was Shaquille O'Neal, the basketball legend. Leonard blinked, wondering if his cold and tired mind was playing tricks on him. But no, it was really Shaq, casually standing at the street corner like he belonged there. Shaquille O'Neal was hard to miss, and not just because of his size. At 7 feet 1 inch, the former NBA superstar was a towering figure who exuded charisma wherever he went. His name was known worldwide, but what made Shaq stand out wasn't just his accomplishments on the basketball court. It was his warm personality, larger-than-life humor, and an undeniable knack for making everyone around him feel valued. Even off the court, Shaq had built a reputation for acts of kindness that seemed almost as big as he was. Whether it was paying off a stranger's bill or buying shoes for kids who couldn't afford them, Shaq had a way of brightening people's days without seeking any attention for it. That morning, Shaq had been in Cleveland for a charity event. He'd finished early and decided to take a walk through the city before heading back to his hotel. Bundled in a warm jacket and his signature custom sneakers, he blended in just enough not to cause an immediate commotion. Yet, wherever he went, heads turned, whispers followed, and people discreetly pulled out their phones to take photos of the NBA legend. Shaq didn't seem to mind. He had grown used to the attention, but his focus was elsewhere. As Shaq approached the corner of Broad Street and 17th Avenue, he noticed Leonard sitting quietly by the wall. Something about the way Leonard held himself caught Shaq's eye. There was no aggression or desperation, just quiet resilience. Leonard wasn't shouting for help or shaking his cardboard sign to grab attention. He simply sat there, his tired eyes scanning the passing crowd, hoping someone would stop. Shaq's pace slowed, and his curiosity grew. He wasn't the kind of person to ignore a gut feeling. Shaq had seen plenty of homeless individuals during his travels, but there was something about Leonard that made him pause. Maybe it was the look in Leonard's eyes, an expression that seemed to carry the weight of 100 stories untold. Or maybe it was just Shaq's natural instinct to help whenever and wherever he could. Either way, he knew he couldn't walk past without doing something. Leonard, on the other hand, had no idea what was about to happen. He noticed the giant man standing nearby, scrolling casually through his phone. Leonard's first thought was how out of place Shaq seemed among the busy crowd. He was too calm, too relaxed, as if the noise and rush of the city didn't affect him at all. Leonard couldn't help but stare for a moment. Then it hit him. He recognized that face. It was Shaquille O'Neal, the basketball superstar, TV personality, and larger-than-life celebrity. Leonard's heart raced. He felt a mix of excitement and nervousness. Celebrities didn't stop for people like him. They lived in a different world, one where problems like hunger and homelessness didn't exist. But something about Shaq's presence felt different. Leonard decided to take a chance. "Hey, big man," Leonard called out, his voice dry and raspy from the cold. He forced a smile, trying to sound casual even though his nerves were getting the best of him. "Can you spare $1?" Shaq froze mid-scroll, his head tilting slightly as if to confirm he had heard correctly. Slowly he turned to face Leonard, his towering frame making Leonard feel even smaller than he already did. For a moment the world seemed to pause. The sound of the city faded, and Leonard braced himself for the usual rejection, a dismissive glance, a polite excuse, or maybe even silence. But what happened next was far from ordinary. Shaq crouched down, lowering his massive frame so he was at eye level with Leonard. It was a simple gesture, but it caught Leonard completely off guard. Nobody ever did that. Most people avoided looking at him altogether, and those who did rarely stopped to engage. Yet here was Shaquille O'Neal, one of the most famous athletes in the world, taking the time to meet him face to face. "What do you need it for?" Shaq asked, his deep voice calm and steady. His tone wasn't judgmental or dismissive. It was genuine, as if he really wanted to know. The question took Leonard by surprise. He wasn't used to people asking him why he needed money. Most either ignored him or threw a coin or two without a second thought. Leonard hesitated, unsure of how to respond. He rubbed his hands together for warmth, his eyes darting to the ground before meeting Shaq's again. "Well," Leonard began, his voice shaky. "A cup of coffee would be nice. Maybe a sandwich if I'm lucky." Shaq nodded, his expression thoughtful. He didn't say anything right away, which made Leonard even more nervous. The silence stretched on for what felt like an eternity, but Shaq's eyes never left Leonard's. It was as if he were trying to see beyond the surface, to understand the man sitting before him. "What's your name?" Shaq finally asked. "Leonard," he replied, his voice barely above a whisper. Shaq extended his massive hand for a handshake. "Nice to meet you, Leonard. I'm Shaq." Leonard couldn't help but chuckle. "I know who you are," he said, a hint of amusement in his voice. Shaq grinned, his warm smile instantly putting Leonard at ease. "All right, Leonard," he said, leaning back slightly. "Here's the deal. I'll help you out, but I need you to promise me something." Leonard's brow furrowed in confusion. "What's that?" he asked, his curiosity piqued. "I want you to help yourself too," Shaq said, his tone serious but not harsh. "If I give you a hand today, you've got to take the next step tomorrow. Deal?" Leonard felt a lump rise in his throat. It wasn't just the words. It was the way Shaq said them. He wasn't scolding or lecturing. He was encouraging Leonard, challenging him to believe in himself again. Leonard nodded, his voice cracking as he replied, "Deal." Shaq reached into his pocket and pulled out his wallet. Leonard expected him to hand over $1, maybe $5 if he was feeling generous. But when Shaq unfolded a crisp $100 bill and held it out, Leonard's eyes widened in disbelief. "Here," Shaq said, placing the bill in Leonard's trembling hands. "This should cover more than coffee." Leonard stared at the money, his mind racing. He had asked for a single dollar, but Shaq had given him so much more. "Are you serious?" Leonard finally managed to ask. Shaq nodded. "I'm serious. But remember, this isn't just about the money. It's about what you do next. You've got more strength in you than you think, Leonard. Don't forget that." Before Leonard could respond, Shaq pulled out a small notepad and pen. He scribbled something quickly and handed the piece of paper to Leonard. "Go to this address tomorrow morning," Shaq said. "Tell them Shaq sent you. They'll help you out." Leonard unfolded the note and saw an address for a local shelter and resource center. He had heard of the place before but had never gone, too ashamed to ask for help. "I'll make sure they're expecting you," Shaq added, his tone firm but kind. The moment felt surreal. Leonard clutched the $100 bill and the note like they were lifelines, his mind reeling from the unexpected kindness. Around them, people had started to gather, their curiosity piqued by the unusual sight of Shaquille O'Neal, crouched on the sidewalk beside a homeless man. Some took photos, others whispered, but Shaq didn't seem to care. "This is about you and me, Leonard," Shaq said, glancing at the growing crowd. "Don't worry about them. Just focus on what you need to do next." Leonard nodded, his eyes glistening with unshed tears. For the first time in years, he felt seen, really seen. As Shaq stood up and prepared to leave, he placed a reassuring hand on Leonard's shoulder. "You've got this, man," he said. "Take it one step at a time." With that, Shaq walked away, disappearing into the crowd. But the impact of his words and actions stayed with Leonard long after he was gone. The next morning, Leonard woke up earlier than usual. He had spent the night in the same spot he always did, under the awning of an old bookstore. But something was different this time. For years, his mornings had been filled with dread and uncertainty. Each day blurred into the next, marked by hunger, cold, and the unshakable feeling of invisibility. Yet today, there was a spark of hope in his chest, faint but undeniable. Leonard carefully unfolded the crumpled piece of paper Shaquille O'Neal had given him. The address stared back at him, and for a moment, he felt a pang of doubt. Was this really going to change anything? What if they turned him away? What if this was just another dead end? But then he thought of Shaq's words. "You've got more strength in you than you think." He clutched the $100 bill in his hand, now safely tucked into the pocket of his worn-out jacket. Leonard wasn't used to having money, and he had spent much of the night debating how to use it. Part of him wanted to buy a hot meal immediately, but he decided against it. If he was going to make a real change, he needed to think carefully. He had to trust that the resource center Shaq had pointed him to could offer more than just temporary relief. The sun was just beginning to rise as Leonard made his way across the city. The streets were quieter than usual, and the crisp morning air bit at his skin. His stomach growled, but he pushed the discomfort aside. Each step toward the address felt heavier than the last. It wasn't just physical exhaustion. Leonard was carrying years of shame and self-doubt on his back. He hadn't walked into a place asking for help in a long time, and the thought of it made his heart race. Finally, Leonard reached the building. It was a modest brick structure with a simple sign that read, "Cleveland Hope Center." A steady stream of people entered and exited, some with tired faces, like his own, others with hopeful smiles. Leonard hesitated at the entrance, his feet rooted to the ground. He watched as a volunteer held the door open for a woman carrying a child. The warmth in their interaction reminded Leonard of a life he had once known. A life where kindness was the norm, not the exception. With a deep breath, Leonard stepped inside. The warmth of the building was a stark contrast to the chilly morning outside. The scent of freshly brewed coffee filled the air, mingling with the faint aroma of baked goods. The room buzzed with activity. Volunteers moving briskly between stations, clients sitting at tables, and the hum of quiet conversations. Leonard felt out of place, unsure of where to go or what to do. A cheerful voice broke through his thoughts. "Good morning. How can we help you today?" Leonard turned to see a young woman with a bright smile and a clipboard in hand. She was dressed in a volunteer t-shirt, her friendly demeanor immediately putting him at ease. Hi," Leonard stammered, his voice barely audible. He cleared his throat and tried again. "Shaq sent me." The woman's eyes widened slightly, her smile growing even brighter. "Oh, you must be Leonard," she exclaimed. "We've been expecting you. Come on, let's get you set up." Leonard blinked in surprise. He hadn't expected Shaq to actually follow through, let alone let the staff know he was coming. For the first time in a long while, Leonard felt like someone had his back. The woman introduced herself as Claire and led Leonard to a small office at the back of the center. Inside, a kind-looking man in his 60s sat behind a desk piled with papers. He stood up as they entered, extending his hand with a warm smile. "Leonard, it's a pleasure to meet you," the man said. "I'm Tom, the director here. Shaq told me about you." Leonard shook Tom's hand, his grip hesitant. "He really called you?" he asked, still finding it hard to believe. Tom chuckled. "He sure did. Said you were ready to make some changes, and we're here to help you do just that." Over the next hour, Tom and Claire walked Leonard through the services the center offered. They explained how he could get access to hot meals, clothing, and medical care. They also talked about programs that could help him find work and even secure temporary housing. Leonard listened intently, his mind racing as he absorbed the information. It felt overwhelming, but in the best way possible. For the first time in years, he was being offered more than just a handout. He was being given a chance to rebuild his life. As they talked, Leonard shared bits and pieces of his story. He told them about the factory job he had lost years ago and how one setback after another had eventually left him on the streets. He spoke of the shame he carried, the relationships he had lost, and the moments he had felt like giving up entirely. Tom and Claire listened without judgment, their empathy evident in their expressions. By the time Leonard left the office, he had a plan in place. He would start by staying at the shelter the center partnered with, where he could get consistent meals and a safe place to sleep. From there, he would enroll in a job training program and work with a counselor to address the mental toll of his experiences. It wouldn't be easy, but for the first time in a long time, Leonard felt like he had a path forward. As he stepped out of the Cleveland Hope Center, Leonard felt the crisp air hit his face once again. But this time it didn't feel as cold. He clutched the note Shaq had given him, now folded neatly in his pocket, and looked up at the sky. The city buzzed around him just as it always had, but today it felt different. The world that once seemed so indifferent now seemed filled with possibility. Leonard knew the road ahead would be long and challenging. There would be setbacks and moments of doubt. But he also knew he wasn't alone. Shaquille O'Neal's simple act of kindness had done more than provide temporary relief. It had reignited a fire within Leonard. He was ready to face whatever came next, one step at a time. Leonard's first night at the shelter was one of the most surreal experiences he'd had in years. After spending so long on the streets, sleeping on cold concrete with one eye open, the simple comfort of a clean bed felt almost foreign. The shelter wasn't luxurious by any stretch, but it was warm, dry, and filled with people who greeted him with kindness instead of indifference. For Leonard, that was more than enough. Yet, as he lay staring at the ceiling, his mind buzzed with doubt. Could he really make this work? Could he truly climb out of the hole he'd been stuck in for so long? The next morning, Leonard woke up early. He didn't want to waste a single moment. He had an appointment with a counselor at the Cleveland Hope Center, and despite his nerves, he was determined to go. The walk to the center felt different this time. The streets, once a source of despair, now seemed alive with opportunity. Leonard noticed details he'd long overlooked: the colorful murals on building walls, the sound of children laughing as they walked to school, and even the way the sunlight filtered through the bare branches of winter trees. It was as if the world had shifted, offering him a second chance he hadn't dared to dream of. When Leonard arrived at the center, he was greeted warmly by Claire, the cheerful volunteer he'd met the day before. She led him to a small office where his counselor, Maria, was waiting. Maria was a middle-aged woman with a calm demeanor and kind eyes. She offered Leonard a cup of coffee and invited him to sit down. The room was cozy, with bookshelves lining the walls and a small potted plant on the desk. It was the kind of space that put Leonard at ease, even as he prepared to open up about parts of his life he hadn't spoken about in years. Maria began their session by explaining how the counseling process worked. She emphasized that this was a safe space where Leonard could share whatever he felt comfortable sharing, and that there was no judgment. Leonard nodded, though he wasn't sure where to begin. For years he had bottled up his emotions, burying them beneath layers of shame and survival instinct. But now, faced with Maria's patient gaze, the words began to spill out. Leonard started with the basics: how he'd grown up in a working-class family, how he'd been a good student, but never had the chance to go to college. He talked about the factory job he'd once held, a job he'd been proud of because it allowed him to provide for himself and his younger brother. But then the factory had closed, and everything had fallen apart. Leonard described the cascade of events that had followed: the months of fruitless job hunting, the eviction notices that had piled up, and the eventual realization that he had nowhere left to go. As he spoke, Maria listened attentively, occasionally nodding or asking gentle questions to encourage him to continue. Leonard found himself sharing things he hadn't even admitted to himself: the bitterness he'd felt toward the world, the guilt over losing touch with his brother, and the deep loneliness that had consumed him during his years on the streets. At one point, his voice broke, and tears filled his eyes. Maria handed him a tissue, her expression one of quiet understanding. By the time their session ended, Leonard felt both exhausted and lighter, as if he'd shed a heavy weight he'd been carrying for far too long. Maria praised him for his courage and assured him that they would work together to help him rebuild his life. She gave him a list of resources to explore and encouraged him to return for another session the following week. Leonard left the office with a sense of relief, his steps a little steadier than they had been before. Next on Leonard's agenda was the job training program. The Cleveland Hope Center had partnered with a local organization that specialized in helping individuals like Leonard re-enter the workforce. The program offered classes on resume writing, interview skills, and even basic computer training. Leonard hadn't touched a computer in years, and the thought of learning new skills was daunting. But he reminded himself of Shaq's words: "You've got more strength in you than you think." The training center was located in a bright, modern building a few blocks away from the shelter. When Leonard walked in, he was greeted by a group of friendly staff members who handed him a schedule of classes and explained how the program worked. He was placed in a small group with other participants, many of whom had stories similar to his own. It was comforting to know he wasn't alone in his struggles. Leonard's first class was on resume writing. The instructor, a young man named Derek, had a knack for making even the most intimidating tasks seem manageable. He walked the group through the basics, explaining how to format a resume and highlight their strengths. Leonard felt a pang of insecurity as he stared at the blank sheet of paper in front of him. What strengths did he have? What could he possibly offer an employer? Derek seemed to sense Leonard's hesitation and approached his desk with a reassuring smile. "Don't overthink it," he said. Let's start with the basics. What kind of work have you done in the past? Leonard hesitated before answering. I worked in a factory for a long time, he said. I was good at it, but I haven't done much since then. Derek nodded thoughtfully. Factory work is a great skill set, he said. It shows you're reliable, hard-working, and detail-oriented. And I bet you picked up more skills than you realize. Let's talk about what those are. As they worked together, Leonard began to see his past experiences in a new light. He realized that the perseverance and resourcefulness he had developed during his years on the streets were strengths in their own right. By the end of the class, he had a rough draft of a resume that he felt surprisingly proud of. It wasn't perfect, but it was a start. The rest of the week was filled with similar small victories. Leonard attended classes on interview techniques, practiced filling out job applications, and even learned how to use a computer. Each new skill he gained felt like a step closer to reclaiming the life he'd lost. The staff and volunteers at the training center were endlessly supportive, always ready with words of encouragement whenever Leonard felt overwhelmed. As the days turned into weeks, Leonard began to feel a shift within himself. He was no longer just surviving, he was building something new. He still had moments of doubt and fear, but they were tempered by the growing belief that he could do this. He thought often of Shaq and the chance encounter that had set this journey in motion. It was a reminder that even the smallest acts of kindness could create ripples that changed lives. By the end of the month, Leonard had completed the training program and started applying for jobs. He knew it wouldn't be easy, but he was determined to keep going. Each rejection letter was a reminder of how far he'd come, and each interview was an opportunity to prove to himself and the world that he was more than his circumstances. Through it all, Leonard stayed connected with the Cleveland Hope Center. He continued his counseling sessions with Maria, who helped him navigate the emotional ups and downs of his journey. He also volunteered at the center whenever he could, wanting to give back to the place that had given him so much. It felt good to help others, to be part of a community that believed in second chances. Leonard's days at the Cleveland Hope Center soon became the cornerstone of his life. Each morning, he woke up with a renewed sense of purpose. The simple routines he now followed felt like a stabilizing force. A warm breakfast at the shelter, followed by classes or job hunting at the center, and evenings spent volunteering or talking to others who had walked paths similar to his. These routines, though seemingly mundane, were building blocks for a future he had dared not dream of just months earlier. One of Leonard's greatest challenges was rebuilding his confidence. Years of rejection and survival on the streets had left deep scars, and while his time at the center was helping him move forward, self-doubt was a constant companion. He often questioned whether he truly deserved a second chance. Did he have what it took to rebuild his life? Did the world even have room for someone like him? These thoughts crept in during quiet moments, but Leonard was learning how to push back against them. Maria, his counselor, was instrumental in this process. During their weekly sessions, she encouraged Leonard to reframe his experiences, to see himself not as a victim of circumstance, but as a survivor who had shown remarkable resilience. She introduced him to exercises that helped him focus on his strengths. One week, she asked Leonard to list 5 things he had accomplished since joining the center. It was a daunting task at first. Leonard's instinct was to downplay his achievements. But as he sat down with pen and paper, the list began to grow. I've written a resume, he wrote tentatively at first. I've learned how to use a computer. I've gone to 3 job interviews. I've helped organize a food drive at the shelter. And I've stayed sober for 30 days. Seeing the words on paper was a powerful moment for Leonard. These weren't small accomplishments. They were proof that he was capable of change. When he shared the list with Maria, she beamed with pride. "This is just the beginning, Leonard," she said. "You're doing the hard work, and it's paying off." As Leonard's confidence grew, so did his sense of connection to the community around him. The Cleveland Hope Center was more than just a resource for him. It was a lifeline that introduced him to people who cared deeply about making a difference. Claire, the cheerful volunteer who had first welcomed him, became a close friend and mentor. She had a knack for lifting Leonard's spirits on tough days, whether it was through a kind word, a shared laugh, or a heartfelt pep talk. She often reminded him that change was a process, not a destination. One afternoon, Claire invited Leonard to help with an outreach event the center was hosting. They were setting up a mobile food pantry in one of the city's most underserved neighborhoods, and Claire thought Leonard's presence could make a real impact. "You know what it's like to be on the other side," she said. "You'll bring a perspective that the rest of us can't." Leonard hesitated at first. The idea of stepping into a leadership role felt daunting. What if he wasn't good enough? What if he made a mistake? But Claire's faith in him was unwavering, and her enthusiasm was contagious. With a mix of nervousness and excitement, Leonard agreed to help. The day of the event dawned bright and crisp. Leonard arrived early to help unload boxes of food and set up tables. The neighborhood was one he recognized. He had slept on these very streets during some of his darkest days. The memories were bittersweet, but Leonard was determined to focus on the task at hand. He wanted to give back to the community that had once been his home. As the event began, families and individuals lined up to receive bags of fresh produce, canned goods, and other essentials. Leonard found himself at the front of the line, greeting each person with a warm smile and helping them carry their items. At first, he was nervous, unsure of what to say. But as he interacted with people, his confidence grew. He listened to their stories, shared his own, and offered words of encouragement. The gratitude in their eyes reminded him of how far he had come, and how much further he still wanted to go. One interaction stood out in particular. A young man named Marcus approached Leonard, his hands shoved deep into his pockets and his gaze fixed on the ground. He looked nervous, almost ashamed, as he mumbled a request for assistance. Leonard saw himself in Marcus, the same uncertainty, the same feeling of being invisible in a world that seemed to pass you by. He handed Marcus a bag of groceries and struck up a conversation. "It's not easy, is it?" Leonard said gently. Marcus glanced up, surprised by the warmth in Leonard's tone. "But you're here, and that means you're stronger than you think. I know what it's like to feel like you're at the bottom, but I promise you, things can get better." Marcus nodded slowly, his eyes softening. "Thanks, man," he said quietly. "I needed to hear that." By the end of the day, Leonard felt an overwhelming sense of pride. He had played a part in making a difference, however small, and the experience left him feeling more connected to the world around him. It was a stark contrast to the isolation he had felt for so long. As he helped to pack up the remaining supplies, Claire approached him with a wide smile. "You were amazing today," she said. "I knew you'd be great, but you exceeded my expectations." Leonard felt a warmth spread through him at her words. For the first time in years, he was starting to believe in himself. He was beginning to see that he had value, not just as someone who had overcome hardship, but as someone who could inspire and uplift others. As Leonard walked back to the shelter that evening, he thought about how far he had come since meeting Shaq in the diner. That chance encounter had set off a chain of events that had completely transformed his life. It wasn't just the financial help Shaq had offered. It was the belief that someone had seen potential in him, even when he couldn't see it in himself. Leonard's journey was far from over. He still faced challenges, finding stable employment, securing permanent housing, and continuing to heal from the wounds of his past. But for the first time in a long time, he felt equipped to face those challenges head-on. He had a support system, a growing sense of purpose, and a belief in his own ability to create a better future. With each step he took, Leonard was not just rebuilding his life. He was reclaiming his identity, one small victory at a time. And in doing so, He was proving to himself and to the world that it was never too late to start again. As Leonard's confidence grew, so did the possibilities in his life. He began to see glimpses of stability, a life he hadn't dared to imagine before. The Cleveland Hope Center had been more than a sanctuary for him. It had become a launch pad. Every day he was taking steps toward independence, and those steps were becoming strides. One of the biggest milestones for Leonard came when Maria introduced him to a job training program. The program focused on equipping people with skills for the modern workforce, basic computer literacy, interview techniques, and even specialized training in fields like construction, customer service, and culinary arts. For Leonard, the culinary track immediately caught his eye. Cooking had always been a secret passion of his. Even during his toughest times on the streets, he'd fantasize about warm meals he could prepare, if only he had the means. The training program was rigorous. Leonard found himself waking up earlier than usual to attend classes and workshops, many of which were held at local community colleges or partner organizations. The first few days were overwhelming. He hadn't been in a classroom setting for years, and the structure was intimidating. But Maria and Claire encouraged him to stick with it, reminding him that growth often came with discomfort. The culinary instructors were tough but supportive. They didn't sugarcoat the realities of working in a professional kitchen, but they also saw Leonard's potential. His natural ability to pair flavors and his attention to detail didn't go unnoticed. One day, Chef Harris, the head instructor, pulled Leonard aside after a particularly challenging class. "Leonard," Chef Harris said, wiping his hands on a towel, "you've got something special. Cooking isn't just about following recipes. It's about telling a story, creating an experience. And you, my friend, have a story to tell." Those words stuck with Leonard. For the first time, he began to see cooking as more than just a skill. It was a way to express himself, to connect with others, and to give back to the world that had given him a second chance. Outside of the training program, Leonard's days were filled with small but meaningful victories. He had started saving money, thanks to a stipend provided by the program, and was even able to purchase a second-hand suit for job interviews. The suit wasn't flashy, but it fit well, and when Leonard looked at himself in the mirror, he barely recognized the man staring back. Gone was the scruffy, defeated figure he had been months ago. In his place stood someone who was trying, someone who was succeeding. As Leonard continued to grow, his relationship with the people around him deepened. Marcus, the young man he had met at the food pantry, started showing up at the Cleveland Hope Center. Inspired by Leonard's words, Marcus had decided to seek help for his own struggles. The two formed an unlikely bond, with Leonard serving as a mentor of sorts. They would often sit together during meals, talking about everything from their favorite sports teams to their dreams for the future. "Man, you make it look so easy," Marcus said one day, shaking his head in awe. "How do you do it?" Leonard chuckled. "It's not easy," he admitted. "Every day I have to choose to keep going. Some days are harder than others, but I just remind myself why I'm doing it. For me, it's about proving to myself that I'm more than my mistakes." Marcus nodded, his expression thoughtful. "I want that too," he said quietly. "I want to be more than my past." Leonard smiled. "Then, you're already on your way," he said. "The fact that you're here, trying, says everything about the kind of person you are." Their conversations became a source of strength for both men, and Leonard found himself taking pride in the role he was playing in Marcus's life. It was a reminder of how far he had come, and how far he still wanted to go. One day, Shaquille O'Neal made a surprise visit to the Cleveland Hope Center. The buzz of excitement spread quickly through the building, and Leonard couldn't help but feel a mix of anticipation and gratitude. Shaq had been the catalyst for his transformation, and seeing him again felt like a full-circle moment. When Shaq walked into the room, his towering presence and infectious smile lit up the space. He greeted everyone warmly, shaking hands and cracking jokes. When he spotted Leonard, his face broke into a wide grin. "Leonard! My man!" Shaq exclaimed, pulling him into a bear hug. "Look at you! You're glowing, man!" Leonard laughed, feeling a surge of emotion. "I've come a long way, Shaq," he said. "And it's all because of that day you stopped to talk to me." Shaq shook his head. "Nah, don't give me all the credit," he said. "You're the one who put in the work. I just gave you a little push." As they talked, Leonard shared updates about his life, his progress in the culinary program, his growing confidence, and his dreams of one day opening his own cafe. Shaq listened intently, nodding and offering words of encouragement. "You've got this, Leonard," he said. "Drowad. Bialifi intendus kyan sariin. Drow." The visit ended with a group photo, but for Leonard, the real takeaway was the reminder of how much support he had in his corner. Shaq's belief in him, Maria's guidance, Claire's friendship, and the community at the Cleveland Hope Center had all played a role in his journey. But more importantly, Leonard was learning to believe in himself. That night, as Leonard sat in his small room at the shelter, he allowed himself to dream. He envisioned a future where he was no longer defined by his past. A future where he was thriving, helping others, and living a life filled with purpose and joy. For the first time in years, that future felt within reach. Weeks turned into months, and Leonard's life was becoming a testament to resilience and hard work. He excelled in his culinary training, earning praise not only for his technical skills, but also for his creativity. He loved experimenting with ingredients, crafting dishes that told stories of his journey. But deep down, Leonard knew that training was only the first step. He needed a breakthrough, an opportunity to show the world what he was capable of. One evening, as Leonard was helping clean up after a community dinner at the Cleveland Hope Center, Maria approached him with a huge smile on her face. Her excitement was palpable, and Leonard felt a spark of curiosity. "Leonard," Maria began, holding a flyer in her hand, "I have something incredible to share with you. There's a citywide cooking competition happening next month. It's called Cleveland Cooks. They're inviting amateur chefs to showcase their talents. I think you should enter." Leonard blinked in surprise. "Me? A cooking competition?" he asked, his voice a mix of disbelief and nervous laughter. "Maria, I've never done anything like that." Maria placed a reassuring hand on his shoulder. "Exactly," she said. "That's why this is the perfect opportunity. You've been working so hard and you have a gift, Leonard. This is your chance to show it to the world." The idea was terrifying, but thrilling. Leonard had never been in the spotlight before. For years he had lived in the shadows, hiding from the world. But now, with Maria's encouragement and the support of his friends at the shelter, he began to entertain the possibility. Over the next few weeks, Leonard poured himself into preparing for the competition. He spent hours practicing in the Cleveland Hope Center's small kitchen, refining recipes, and experimenting with flavors. His signature dish, a soulful gumbo inspired by his late grandmother, became his masterpiece. The dish was a reflection of his roots, his struggles, and his triumphs. It was deeply personal, and every spoonful told a story. Claire and Marcus became his unofficial taste testers, eagerly sampling his creations and offering feedback. "This is amazing, Leonard," Claire said one evening, savoring a bite of gumbo. "It's like comfort in a bowl. You're going to blow everyone away." Marcus nodded enthusiastically. "Man, if they don't give you first place, they're crazy," he said. "This gumbo is fire." Leonard smiled, their words boosting his confidence. But beneath his determination lay a simmering fear. What if he failed? What if he wasn't good enough? He couldn't shake the memories of all the times life had knocked him down. But then he would think of Shaq's words, Maria's unwavering belief, and his own promise to himself to keep moving forward. The day of the competition arrived, and Leonard found himself standing in a bustling event hall filled with culinary hopefuls. The atmosphere was electric, with the clatter of pots and pans and the hum of excitement filling the air. Leonard's nerves threatened to overwhelm him, but he took a deep breath and reminded himself why he was there. As he set up his station, he noticed a familiar figure in the crowd. It was Shaq, towering above everyone else, his presence impossible to miss. Leonard's heart swelled with gratitude and determination. Shaq had kept his promise to support him, and seeing him there gave Leonard the extra push he needed. The competition began, and Leonard dove into his work. He moved with focus and precision, every step a testament to the hours he had spent preparing. The aroma of his gumbo filled the air, drawing curious glances from nearby competitors and judges. When the time came to present his dish to the panel of judges, Leonard felt a wave of emotion. He stood tall, his hands steady despite the butterflies in his stomach. "This gumbo is more than just a dish," he said, his voice steady but heartfelt. "It's a piece of my story, a story of struggle, resilience, and hope. I hope it brings you the same comfort it brought me during my darkest times." The judges tasted his gumbo, their expressions transforming from curiosity to delight. One judge, a renowned chef known for his blunt critiques, leaned back in his chair and said, "This is exceptional. The depth of flavor, the balance of spices. This is the kind of dish that stays with you." Leonard's heart soared. For the first time in his life, he felt truly seen and validated. The rest of the competition passed in a blur, and when the winners were announced, Leonard's name was called as the runner-up. Though he didn't win first place, the recognition was a victory in itself. The judges praised his talent and encouraged him to pursue a career in the culinary world. After the competition, Shaq approached Leonard with a beaming smile. "You did it, man," he said, pulling Leonard into a hug. "I told you. You're a star." Leonard laughed, the weight of his fears melting away. "I couldn't have done it without you, Shaq," he said. "Thank you for believing in me." Shaq shook his head. "Don't thank me," he said. "You believed in yourself, and that's what matters. This is just the beginning, Leonard. The world needs to see more of what you've got." That night, as Leonard lay in bed, he reflected on how far he had come. The competition had been a turning point, but, more importantly, it had reaffirmed his belief in his own potential. He wasn't just surviving anymore, he was thriving, and he was ready for whatever came next. The buzz from the competition didn't fade away quickly. In the days that followed, Leonard received several calls from local restaurants and culinary organizations. Word of his incredible gumbo and heartfelt story had spread, and people were eager to see what he would do next. It was as if the city of Cleveland had collectively decided to lift Leonard up, giving him the recognition he had fought so hard to earn. One of those calls stood out among the rest. It was from a well-known chef in Cleveland, Chef Armand Rene, who owned one of the most prestigious restaurants in the city, Maison de Clay. Chef Armand was known for his innovative take on comfort food, and his restaurant had won multiple awards. "Leonard, I tasted your gumbo at the competition," Chef Armand said when they met for coffee at a local cafe. "It was extraordinary. The flavors were soulful, like they had a story to tell. I want you to come work in my kitchen. You have something special, and I believe you could take your skills to the next level." Leonard was stunned. Maison de Clay wasn't just any restaurant. It was the kind of place that could launch a chef's career to unimaginable heights. But with the offer came a flood of insecurities. Was he ready to step into such a high-pressure environment? Could he keep up with the demands of a top-tier kitchen? He confided in Maria and Shaq, who both encouraged him to seize the opportunity. "You've earned this, Leonard," Maria said. "It's time to show the world what you're capable of." "Don't doubt yourself, man," Shaq added. "You've already proven you can handle anything life throws at you. Go in there and do what you do best. Bolstered by their support, Leonard accepted Chef Armand's offer. His first day at Maison de Clé was both exhilarating and overwhelming. The kitchen was a whirlwind of activity, with chefs moving in perfect synchronization like a well-rehearsed orchestra. The stakes were high, and the expectations even higher. Leonard was assigned to work under one of the sous chefs, a sharp-tongued but incredibly skilled woman named Elena. She didn't waste time with pleasantries. "This isn't a place for mistakes," she said bluntly. "If you're here, you'd better be ready to give 110% every single day." The pressure was immense, but Leonard threw himself into the work with everything he had. He arrived early and stayed late, studying the techniques of the other chefs and practicing tirelessly. There were moments of doubt, times when he felt like he wasn't good enough, but he pushed through. Each day, he grew more confident, more skilled. One evening, Chef Armand called Leonard into his office. "I've been watching you," he said. "You're not just talented, you're driven. That's what sets great chefs apart. I want you to create a dish for our menu, something that's entirely yours." Leonard was floored. The opportunity to have a dish on Maison de Clé's menu was a dream come true. He spent the next few weeks perfecting his creation, a modern twist on his grandmother's gumbo, incorporating elements of fine dining while staying true to its soulful roots. When the dish was finally served to Chef Armand and the rest of the staff, the room fell silent as they tasted it. Then, slowly, smiles spread across their faces. Chef Armand nodded in approval. "This is it," he said. "This is the kind of dish that tells a story, that makes people feel something. It's going on the menu." The debut of Leonard's gumbo was a resounding success. Customers raved about the dish, and its popularity skyrocketed. For Leonard, it was more than just a culinary achievement. It was a symbol of how far he had come. One evening, as Leonard stood in the bustling kitchen, he took a moment to look around. The man who had once been homeless, who had doubted his worth, was now a respected chef in one of Cleveland's finest restaurants. He thought about the people who had believed in him, Maria, Marcus, Claire, Shaq, and felt a deep sense of gratitude. But Leonard knew his journey wasn't over. This was just the beginning. He had found his voice, his purpose, and he was ready to use it to inspire others. His next goal was to open his own restaurant, a place where people from all walks of life could come together over food that told stories of resilience and hope. As Leonard settled into his new job at Maison de Clé, the restaurant that had once seemed like an impossible dream, he could hardly believe how far he had come. The struggles of living on the streets, the feeling of hopelessness that had clung to him like a shadow for so long, were now just memories. Instead, he found himself surrounded by a team of people who believed in him, led by a supportive mentor in Shaquille O'Neal. Shaq, with his larger-than-life personality and unmatched generosity, had become more than just a friend. He was a guiding force in Leonard's transformation. Every day Leonard arrived early, working hard and learning new things about the restaurant business, from the delicate art of customer service to the complexities of kitchen management. The path wasn't always easy, but each challenge made him stronger, and each small success gave him the confidence to dream bigger. Maria, who had been with him from the beginning, continued to be a pillar of support. She watched as Leonard grew, as he found his purpose and his place in a world that had once seemed so indifferent to him. They worked side by side, with Maria now taking on a larger role at the restaurant, helping with both the kitchen and the front-of-house operations. Their bond deepened, and Leonard could feel the weight of the promises he had made to her, to not only rebuild his life, but to build a future for both of them. It wasn't just about survival anymore. It was about thriving, about creating something meaningful that would not only change his life, but also the lives of others. As Leonard's reputation grew within the restaurant, so did his confidence. He began to entertain the idea of starting his own place, a restaurant where he could combine everything he had learned with his passion for food. Shaq, ever the supportive mentor, encouraged him to take the leap. "You've got the heart for it, Leonard," Shaq would say, his voice booming with belief in him. "You've been through the hardest things anyone could imagine. Building a restaurant, building your future, that's just another challenge. And I know you're ready." Shaq's words resonated with Leonard deeply. It wasn't just about the food anymore. It was about creating a space where people could come together, a place that felt like home to anyone who walked through the door. The idea of his own restaurant was no longer a distant dream. Leonard began looking for locations, doing research, and mapping out what he needed to make it a reality. It wasn't easy. Finding the right space, negotiating leases, and figuring out the financing were all huge hurdles. But with Shaq's guidance and Maria's unwavering support, Leonard felt like he could tackle anything. One evening, as they sat down to go over the numbers, Maria turned to him with a smile. "You know, I've been thinking," she said, her voice full of excitement. "What if we make this a place that gives back? What if we create a model where we can hire people who are going through tough times, just like you did? We can offer second chances, just like you got." Leonard's heart swelled with pride. It was exactly what he had always wanted, to not only change his own life, but to help others do the same. Together, they could create something bigger than just a restaurant. It would be a place of healing, a place where everyone could find hope. Finding the perfect location was a challenge, but eventually, Leonard found an old building in a bustling part of the city. It was small, but with a little work, he knew it could be transformed into something special. He signed the lease, hired a small team of staff, and began the process of designing the restaurant. They chose a name that felt fitting for Leonard's journey: the Second Chance Grill. It was more than just a name. It was a promise to the people who walked through the doors that they too could rebuild their lives, just like Leonard had. He and Maria spent long hours working on the menu, using fresh local ingredients to create dishes that reflected Leonard's love of comfort food and Maria's culinary skills. They wanted the food to tell a story, just like Leonard's journey had. Opening day arrived, and it was everything Leonard had hoped for. The doors to the Second Chance Grill opened to a warm reception, with friends, family, and even strangers showing up to support the new restaurant. Shaq, of course, was there, standing tall with a big smile on his face. He had always believed in Leonard, but seeing him standing in his own restaurant, surrounded by people who believed in him too, was a moment Shaq would never forget. "You did it, my man," Shaq said, pulling Leonard into a big hug. "You made it happen." Leonard smiled, overwhelmed with gratitude. It was more than just the success of the restaurant. It was the realization that he had created something meaningful, a place that not only served food, but also offered a sense of belonging, a place where people could come together and find a little bit of hope. As the months went by, the Second Chance Grill became a fixture in the community. People came for the food, but they returned because of the atmosphere. Leonard's story, his journey from homelessness to restaurant owner, resonated with so many people. It wasn't just about the food, it was about the feeling of possibility, of redemption that the restaurant offered. Word spread, and soon, Leonard found himself speaking at local events, sharing his story, and encouraging others to never give up, no matter how tough life got. Maria continued to be his partner in every sense of the word, and together they helped shape the direction of the restaurant, making sure it stayed true to its roots of offering second chances. One day, as Leonard was sitting in the back office, looking over the restaurant's finances, Maria walked in with a big grin on her face. "Guess what?" she said. "We've got an offer. They want to franchise the Second Chance Grill." Leonard's eyes widened in disbelief. The restaurant, which had started as a simple dream, was now growing in ways he hadn't even imagined. It wasn't just about his success anymore. It was about creating opportunities for others, spreading the message of hope and redemption across the country. As they sat down to discuss the offer, Leonard couldn't help but feel a deep sense of pride. It had been a long journey, but every struggle, every setback, had led him to this moment. He had built something meaningful, something that would last long after he was gone. And it all started with one simple act of kindness from Shaq, a man who had believed in him when no one else did. Leonard leaned back in his chair and smiled. "We're just getting started," he said. And for the first time in a long while, he truly believed it. The story of the Second Chance Grill continued to inspire others, reminding everyone that no matter how dark life may seem, there's always a chance for redemption, a chance to rebuild, and a chance to start anew. And as Leonard looked around at the restaurant he had built, surrounded by the people he loved, he knew that he had truly found his purpose, not just in serving food, but in giving others the chance to turn their lives around, just like he had done. If you like this story, subscribe Storyboat and turn notifications on to get early access to the upcoming interesting stories like this.